Hello everyone, and welcome to the 182nd episode of Analyzing Evil, featuring Silco from Arcane. Arcane is one of the best video game adaptations we've ever been given, with a beautiful art style, excellent writing, and memorable characters. Arcane certainly deserves all the praise it's been given, and in that same vein, so does Silco, a villain who's as aesthetically pleasing as he is personally intriguing. Silco has been requested to be featured in an episode for some time now, and while there is a second season of Arcane coming out soon, considering how his story ended in Season 1, I figured it would be alright to talk about him now, and maybe make an update video after the second season drops if we receive anything important about his character. Now unfortunately, I'm a huge fan of League of Legends, and while the established lore in game is pretty expansive and interesting, Arcane at this point is part of a separate canon, so we won't be discussing any information from the game's lore in this video, just so you're aware. But we will be doing some theory crafting regarding some of the components of Silco's story, and of course, examining everything we're given about Silco so we might better understand the evil he embodies. A quick side note, my editor is actually a musical artist, and he's recently released an 80s inspired album, which is definitely my kind of music. So if you're interested in hearing something great, click the link on your screen, or the one down in the description. Now without further ado, let's begin. While we aren't really told the origins of Piltover's Undercity, I think we can make a few assumptions about how this area of the city came into existence. In a council meeting where Jace is attempting to gain the councilor's blessing to research magical applications to scientific technology, the councilors remark that Piltover was originally founded as a refuge for people attempting to escape the power-mongering of mages, which makes sense considering the abuse of magic is rampant in Runeterra, and many peoples of different nations have essentially been made homeless due to their machinations, something that's reflected in the diverse nature of Piltover's population. Now Silco remarks to the Chem Barons when he's having a meeting with them that they've forgotten where they've come from, the mines where the air was so thick, it clogged a person's throat. And while this is certainly an aspect of the Undercity that has continuously been promoted by the elite of Piltover in order to keep raw materials flowing into Piltover's factories and foundries, with this bit of information, as well as the fact that Piltover was founded by refugees, we can make a reliable assumption about how the Undercity came into existence. When the refugees arrived on the land that would one day be Piltover, they began doing what anyone does when people aspire to build a city. They started gathering the resources they would need for its construction. Like any society, this group of people no doubt had its leaders and its followers, and while the architects and the engineers busied themselves with planning this new city, the laborers began gathering ores from the apparently abundant veins that surrounded or lurked below this land's surface. And well, the people who dug went down, and the people ordering the digging were raised up. And slowly over the course of many years, a glaring level of disparity between the haves and the providers to the haves became not just the norm in Piltover, but an aspect of their society that the elite willingly perpetuated in order to facilitate the massive leaps in progress they achieved in just a few centuries' time, leaving the people who had toiled in these mines to rot in the dank and suffocating environment they had forged with their own hands, which was only made worse by the use of this dark underbelly as the center of chemical manufacturing, waste disposal, and sewage collection. This is the ugly side of the progress that the Piltovans hold in such high regard. Fume-belching factories are needed to forge the components necessary for scientific innovations. Vast mining operations are required to feed the factories the materials they need, and caustic chemicals that give life to these ingenious machines are concocted in hazardous plants, all of which inevitably produces massive amounts of waste and runoff that the elite of Piltover seem willing to let fester in the Undercity. While this type of societal structure isn't exactly unique to Piltover, as many cities in our own world are essentially a mix of poor to middle-class districts that house laborers skilled and unskilled, and wealthier districts that enjoy the fruits of these labors, that doesn't make what these citizens were forced to endure any less harrowing. While these conditions ensured that some sort of criminal culture would develop as people attempted to survive by any means necessary, it also made the Undercity ripe for the development of civil unrest that would eventually evolve into organized rebellion, which is exactly what happened when Silco was coming of age. Raised in these deplorable conditions and forced to toil for elites he would only see through the waste they threw down into his home, Silco was hardened by the state of his world like many people around him, and through proximity and shared woes, Silco presumably formed bonds of kinship with many of his downtrodden countrymen, chief among them, a man he would come to consider a brother, Vander. Vander, an imposing and tenacious man who was ready to stick it to the topsiders to secure better lives for his people, became the figurehead of this rebellion, and Silco was likely at Vander's side throughout the early stages of the formation of the rebellion. However, as most of you will know, Silco and Vander had a brutal falling out when they were both very young that almost killed Silco, as during the flashback we're given that shows us the fight they had, Vander hadn't yet grown his signature beard, and when the battle on the bridge occurred, he had his beard, so they must have had some sort of disagreement about the direction this rebellion should take. And though we can only speculate on what that might have been at this point, knowing Silco, I imagine that he presented an idea to Vander that involved the use of unscrupulous means to accomplish their goals that caused such a visceral reaction in Vander. Though that might be the case, Vander was certainly ready to pummel anyone in his path to a pulp in order to win the fight against the Topsiders, which is evident by the barbarity of his actions during the Battle of the Bridge. But we'll talk about that a little later on, as we first need to discuss the impact that this fight had on Silco. Silco's near death at Vander's hands, more so than what he was forced to endure during his childhood, decided the course that Silco would take in life. When Silco fell into the polluted river of the Undercity, he underwent a deadly change that, as he puts it, forged him into something greater than he was before, the water enveloping every fiber of his being and offering him a choice. Do nothing and let it take you, or fight with everything you have to survive. And Silco chose to fight, shedding his old and weak self and installing a stalwart resolve in him to do whatever it took to defeat an enemy that was greater than he, becoming a monster in order to stop the monster that is Piltover. Now here is where I think it's appropriate that we examine Silco by comparing him to Vander, as Vander and Silco are similar yet different characters in so many ways. Personality and appearance-wise, at the time this story begins, Vander and Silco couldn't be more opposite. Vander is the burly, gruff, and quietly charismatic protector of his world that inspires love and loyalty in his people by virtue of his kind-hearted persona and legendary reputation alone, a bear of a man that's as intimidating as he is welcoming. Just as Silco's near-death experience changed his life, Vander's experiences during the Battle of the Bridge changed his. In the aftermath of this battle, Vander spied a young Vi in powder amidst the carnage and had a sudden moment of clarity, realizing that in his efforts to win his war against the Topsiders, he'd neglected to account for the personal cost of such a war. And seeing the now orphan girls before him, Vander vowed to end this violence so that the suffering his people were already enduring wouldn't be amplified further by the byproducts of a long and bloody war that was far from being a guaranteed victory for the denizens of the Undercity. So while Vander was certainly still a force to be reckoned with, he was no longer willing to entertain what Silco calls the base violence necessary for change, becoming a father to his people that was more concerned with preserving their lives at any cost than he was with freeing them from the oppression of the Topsiders, even if that meant continuing the suffering he had once dedicated his very life to ending. Now Silco, on the other hand, while certainly intimidating, is decidedly less welcoming. With his slender frame, sharp and angular facial features accented by scarred skin, and his black eye with a piercing orange iris in the shape of a shattered star, Silco's appearance is haunting and menacing, to say the least. His personality does add to his sinister aura, but it also goes a long way in softening it as well. Silco is often quite reserved, though there are a few times where we see him expressing anger, desperation, and even nervousness, but he projects an air of dark elegance and nobility that borders on haughty and snide, and he's often quite condescending when he's speaking with someone, choosing to speak in a deliberate, authoritative, and thought-provoking way that echoes the seriousness with which he conducts his every move. For Silco, like Vander once was, is a man who is totally consumed by everything that he is trying to achieve. To defeat a superior enemy, you must stop at nothing, become what they fear. That is Silco's mantra, and he will stop at nothing to ensure that the Undercity is lifted up from a mere dreg of the so-called City of Progress into its own nation, the nation of Zaun, a city free from oppression, whose people can decide their own fates and better their lives without the interference of elites in lofty towers exploiting their labors for their benefit. One of the main differences between Vander and Silco, though, is the way that they express their intelligence. Vander is just as intelligent as Silco is, but his intelligence is underpinned by an emotional intelligence, which has driven every action he has taken since he chose to forsake his cause, actions that are tempered by empathy and the more personal connection that he has with his people. Silco's intelligence, however, is guided by grandiose visions of the future and a win by any means necessary attitude, and the overwhelming intellect he contains within his person manifests itself in sly cunning, a talent for manipulation, and the formation of far-reaching and complex plans that have no limits as far as morality is concerned. By exercising patience and caution, Silco has essentially risen from the dead and become a pervasive, yet hidden force that operates in the shadows of the Undercity. And after he's kidnapped and eliminated Vander, he goes from being the covert operative to the legitimate, yet still hidden lord of the Undercity, as though he's taken Vander's former base of operations, the Last Drop, and modified it into his personal fortress. He's still considered nothing more than a businessman, which is aided in large part by his contract with Marcus, the sheriff in charge of the enforcers. Another example of just how far Silco's plans plans have allowed him to rise, and in essence, he had made himself into a mixture of a crime lord and covert rebel leader who controls every aspect of the Undercity, a position which he uses to slowly make all the preparations necessary to fulfill his plans. And the importance of this position, as well as his willingness to sacrifice anything or anyone in order to ensure his victory, cannot be understated. Just like Vander when he was younger, people are an afterthought for Silco. They are the group he's trying to save, but individually, they are tools to be used, and using minions as cannon fodder, or exploiting innocence, is to Silco a necessary aspect of his struggle that, while unfortunate, is a means that is justified by the ends he's trying to achieve, which is made quite apparent by the signature drug that he peddles, Shimmer. Shimmer, while apparently having some practical uses, as it's capable of repairing severe damage to a person's body or staving off existing injuries, like with Silco's eye, is more so a superweapon that Silco aims to infect his armies, or perhaps even the entire Undercity with, to transform them into nigh unstoppable mutants, with immense strength and resilience that can sustain even the heaviest damage to their persons. This application harkens back to Silco's mantra of becoming what his enemies fear, and doing whatever it takes to get the better of his enemies no matter the cost, as Silco knows that the citizens of the Undercity have no chance at defeating Piltover in an open conflict, and because Silco believes such a conflict is the only means with which he can free his people, he's attempting to augment them so they can stand a chance at defeating their oppressors. Piltover's resources are too great, their armies too well equipped, and their strategical advantage afforded by their city's position above the Undercity makes it so that an assault from below is more so a nuisance than it is a legitimate threat. And to make matters worse, there seems to be only one way that an organized Undercity resistance effort could ferry its armies into Piltover, that being via the bridge that connects them. And pushing an under-equipped army into a meat grinder is an untenable position that Silco knows is hopeless. So if you can't match their firepower, you must find an alternative means with which you can combat such a superior foe. And while that often results in organizations like Silco's resorting to guerrilla warfare to outmaneuver their enemies, in his case, Shimmer gives him the capability to make his army stronger physically that would then allow them to burst through the aforementioned meat grinder and claim their victory. The problem with this method is it has amplified the suffering his people already experience on a daily basis, as along with the toxins and the pollutants the citizens of the Undercity are forced to endure, they now also have a drug rampaging through their streets that has further ground his people's living conditions down to the point that the lanes of the Undercity were now populated by an increased number of sickly and despondent people who were far worse off under Silco's care than they were before. But again, this to Silco was seen as a necessary sacrifice that was made bearable in the pursuit of the greater good. And though the man Silco has become and his ambitions are horrifying, all of what he tried to achieve may very well have been accomplished had it not been for one person, Jinx. When Silco saw Powder crying in that alley in the aftermath of his skirmish with Vander and his children, he saw her as what he sees everyone, a tool, a young and malleable mind that he could warp into a powerful ally that could serve as his greatest asset. But Silco never expected that this bond would turn into something that would completely shatter his worldview, attachment. Like Vander before him, Silco's relationship with Jinx evolved into that of a father-daughter dynamic, and though Jinx had been mentally scarred by what she'd been put through as a result of Silco's machinations, he became the only person in her life who she perceived as not abandoning her in her time of need. Silco's relationship with Jinx slowly reinstilled within him the personal connection he had once had with his people, which was often displayed in the preferential treatment that he showed Jinx when compared to his other subordinates, to the point that Silco was so desperate to save her life that he, as is quite typical with Silco, was willing to do anything to save her life after she was injured during her battle with Echo, including injecting her with the mind and body altering shimmer that sent her mental state further over the edge than it already was. Jinx was what everyone else around Silco wasn't. She was a person, someone that he grew to love and care for, much like he once loved and cared for Vander. And this love led Silco's life on a course he could have never anticipated, towards an arc that would end up being identical to Vander's. When Vander saw the orphan Vi and Jinx on that bridge so many years ago, he realized that ending the cycle of violence and suffering is what mattered more than anything. And though he had been trying to do just that, he understood then that he was trying to do so by using violence and suffering as a means to end violence and suffering. And to drive this point home further, we have the fact that Vander was the one that created the monstrous version of Silco that we see in this series, as it was Vander's choice to stamp Silco out with violence, much like he aimed to stamp out the Topsiders, that severed Silco's intimate connection with his people, and corrupted him into a brutal man who was obsessed with conquering his enemies at any cost, which is something that Vander deeply regretted once he was confronted with the results of the actions he took on that fateful day. Silco almost came to understand the importance of stopping this cycle as well, but this realization came far too late. When Jace offered complete autonomy and peace for Zahn to Silco, his only condition was that Jinx be handed over to him so someone could be held accountable for the crimes she and Silco had committed. In this moment, Silco was presented with an easy way to achieve everything he had dreamed of, but the man who would have once sacrificed each and every citizen of the Undercity to fulfill his goals was suddenly struck by an inability to sacrifice a single person for the greater good that he hoped to manifest. In pursuit of his goals, Silco had lost the man he once was, a man who cared deeply for his people, becoming instead a man who was so consumed by the idea that freedom was worth any price, that he forgot that price was to be paid by the sacrifice of those he had once loved so deeply. And Jinx reminded him that he had once considered life so precious that he would dedicate his own to preserving that life. And now that he had such an intimate reminder poised to be taken from him, he could not bear to do it. But even with such a realization, even with the idea that he needed to protect those closest to him firmly implanted in his mind, Silco wasn't going to change his ways. He wasn't going to become like Vander and abandon his dreaded cause to make himself and his world into something better, to be better than those that tried to keep him down. No, Silco was going to continue with his plans. He was going to save Jinx and burn the entire world to the ground just to keep her safe. And Silco may very well have succeeded in doing so, but that would have never solved the problems he was trying to fix. When fighting a rebellion, there is a fine line between embodying the righteous ideals of your cause and succumbing to the dark inclinations a desperate fight for autonomy can spark in a person. And you can either become a person that those you're trying to overcome are desperately fighting against because they know that you are an echo of the wrongs they've committed, that they will do anything to put down so they won't have to suffer the consequences of their crimes, or a person who lowers themselves to the level of their oppressors and becomes a monstrous threat that deserves to be put down in the eyes of those you're fighting. And what matters most here is not what the elite of the opposing side think of you, but what the common people those elites rule think of you. If you can manage to paint yourself as freedom fighters that are attempting to gain the same rights and freedoms that are enjoyed by the people living comfortably under your oppressors, you have a better chance of overcoming your enemies by exposing their crimes and emphasizing that you are just as human as they are, who deserve to be treated as such. But if you make yourselves into monsters that even those who you might share common values with fear and despise, then you only intensify the problems you're trying to solve, as in all likelihood, they'll only see you and your organization as a threat that's attempting to disrupt their way of life and harm their loved ones, not a legitimate and noble cause that's to be sympathized with and supported. There is often never a perfect answer to what the oppressed should do in order to combat their oppressors, and though it's not ideal, sometimes the base violence necessary for change is indeed necessary. But as Victor says to Jace when presented with the idea that they should build weapons in order to combat the Undercity threat, there is always a choice, as there are other options available to pursue that will cause less harm to yourself and the people that you're trying to convince to recognize you as people in the long run. Some who might not deserve to be free from harm, but who can certainly be dealt with in time in ways that are more conducive to promoting the peace and prosperity that you're looking to create. So yes, Silco may have been able to win his fight. He could have burned all of Piltover to the ground and rebuilt it into the nation of Zaun, a bastion of freedom that might have been a fine replacement for the system he destroyed. But because Silco sought to do so by making himself and his people into monsters born from further suffering and misery that he had unleashed upon them. And in all likelihood, Silco would have created more problems for every life that he touched, rather than solving any existing ones. As unfortunately, Silco by the end of this story was too far gone, a man who couldn't surmount all that he'd been made into by everything that he'd experienced to become something greater as he had hoped, but one who was destined to be a monstrosity that created monsters till the end of his days. Had he lived any longer, that is. For you reap what you sow, and in the end, Silco met his demise at the hands of a monster that he had created. So was Silco an evil man? Yes, he was. He was a man who ordered the deaths of countless innocents and enemy combatants alike. A man who had corrupted so many of his people, not just with the poison he peddled to them, but with his ambitions, transforming them into creatures of his twisted rebellion, rather than the champions of a noble cause. But his evil was intermixed with virtuous purpose, evil that had been instilled within him by the circumstances of his birth, and the dire conditions of the noxious world he was forced to live in. An evil that was born through strife, misery, and the exploitation of people, that has always, and will always breed discontent, and a desire for freedom. And much of who Silco became can be summed up by the words Victor says to Jace when they're contemplating the ramifications of Hextech, that in the pursuit of great, they failed to do good. And indeed, that was who Silco was. A man who was so consumed by the grand idea of freedom that he forgot himself along the way. A man who desperately wanted to bring about good in the world by giving all of himself to evil, an evil that will unfortunately live on long after his demise. Thank you all for tuning in to this episode of Analyzing Evil, and I hope you've enjoyed. What are your thoughts on Silco? Let me know down below, and leave a suggestion for a villain you'd like to see featured while you're at it. If you like this video, hit that thumbs up button, and make sure to subscribe if you haven't already. A big thank you to all of my subscribers, my patrons, and anyone who's decided to honor me with a super thank, and a most vile thank you to those whose names you're seeing on screen now. Join the channel's Discord server and subreddit to interact with myself and the community, and follow me on the social media platforms listed below to keep up with the channel. As always, thanks for watching, and I'll be seeing you soon.